right, welcome back to what I'm sure feels like never-ending lectures on Vietnam. As promised with the very beginning, it is complicated, it's hard, there's a lot of pieces moving around, and even people at the time had very strong feelings with regards and differing opinions with regards to Vietnam. So we're going to continue to do the best we can. We have talked about the history of Vietnam. We talked about French rule in Vietnam. We've talked about how the Vietnam War got started. We've talked about fighting the war, the difficulty of fighting the war from the jungle to the tunnel system of the Viet Cong. We talked how the United States attempted to get around that with the use of Agent Orange and napalm. We talked about the difficulty of the fact that it was hard to actually determine who the enemy was. Um, we mentioned the concept of the living room war, that for the first time we had people embedded with the U.S. troops, and Americans were able to see this, and it greatly affected the American concept of the war, and that people began to say, well, I'm seeing one thing on the TV, but the government's telling me something else. Who do I believe? I'm going to believe my own eyes. I don't know that I trust my government, and that leads to the big concept of the credibility gap. We've talked about the war at home, the draft, how to avoid the draft, it being a war of the poor, the questions African Americans had with regards to that, the growing opposition from the youth movement, the protests, are you a dove, are you a hawk? And so what I'm going to attempt to do in a somewhat short period of time is talk about the year of 1968. So again, I've really suggested that as you're watching Edpuzzles, especially with this chapter, if you've not done it with any other, you need to print out the notes. You need to make sure that you're writing notes on these notes so that you can go back and reflect and review everything that's going on in Vietnam. Now, what I would suggest for this is that you keep a running list of the year 1968, because we're going to come back and mention all the things that happened within the year 1968. It's seen as a turning point year for the United States in a way, in terms of culture, definitely with regards to the Vietnam War. So we're going to look at it almost month by month, that there's something happening major within the United States in the year 1968. So we're going to start with January of 68. In January of 68, a major, wow, it's 50 years ago. So 50 years ago, here's what's going on. There's a major event known as the Tet Offensive. Now, this happens on what is known as the let me get this right, the Vietnamese New Year is called Tet. And different cultures, obviously everybody recognized that the Gregorian calendar, the one that we use that goes January through December, is the quote unquote official calendar for dealing for interactions. But different cultures have their own cultural calendar. There's a Jewish calendar. I believe the Muslims have their calendar. That's why their holidays appear to fluctuate. There's the Chinese calendar, and so the Vietnamese have their own cultural calendar as well. And the beginning of their new year is Tet. And in 1968, it happened to occur on January 30th. And so the decision was made amongst both the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the South Vietnamese, and the United States, that there would be no fighting on Tet, so that people could feel free to ring in the new year, but also more importantly, so that funerals could take place and that the dead could be buried at a time without chaos and war. It was a mutual truce that was called upon by all agreed parties. So it makes what happens that much kind of embarrassing for the United States. The Viet Cong, so that's the rebel group, communist group in South Vietnam that we're fighting, didn't abide by that at all. Instead, they used that to launch a major surprise attack against the Americans. They hid weapons in coffins that were in town so people wouldn't even really think about it. And on January 30th, they attacked over 100 towns in South Vietnam, 12 U.S. air bases, and the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. And what gets reported to Americans on TV is that there's absolute chaos going on in Vietnam, that we aren't in control, that a small group that we were supposed to beat within months has completely manipulated the U.S. military. It lasts for over a month. That's how long it takes for the United States to regain control over those areas that were ambushed on January 30th. Now, in the end, America came out a whole lot better. We only lost approximately 3,000 soldiers to approximately 32,000 that the Viet Cong lost. But that's not what Americans see. That's not what Americans remember, and that's not what they associate with the Tet Offensive. Americans are now believe that they have been fed lies with regards to the U.S. progress within Vietnam. It causes more Americans to turn against Vietnam. It definitely causes a lot more Americans to begin to question what in the heck are we doing in Vietnam, and it succeeds in widening the credibility gap. And that's pretty much the only success you're going to get out of the Tet Offensive. And that's how we're starting off 1968, with Americans once again saying, what in the world's going on? What's true? What's fake? Should I continue to send my children to die for a cause that we can't all agree with what's going on? McNamara resigns. He's replaced by Clark Clifford, and LBJ's popularity plummets. Now 60% disapprove with how he's dealing with the war. If you remember when the war started, 60% approved of the war. Now that same number disapproved. Johnson is having abysmal popularity ratings. All right, so the election of 1968 gets super duper tricky. So long before the Tet Offensive had actually happened, so within 67, because 68 is an election year, there had been some movement against Johnson and people within the Democrat Party that wanted to launch an anti-war candidate. And it's kind of unusual, because if your president has the ability, if a sitting president has the ability to be reelected, the party, typically out of party loyalty, will support them and not launch competing candidates. And if there is a large talk about competing candidates, then that's not really good for you if you're president. A lot of people wanted Robert Kennedy to run. He was the brother of John F. Kennedy. He had been his attorney general. He was still active in government, and people just really felt like he was their candidate. He was also anti-Vietnam War. But Robert Kennedy declines because out of party loyalty. The Kennedys are Democrats through and through, and they're not going to do something that's going to jeopardize the power structure of the Democratic Party. But Eugene McCarthy, who was a senator from Minnesota, is like, I absolutely don't care about party loyalty. I care about ending the war in Vietnam. So he throws his hat in the ring. Early on, he does it in 67. So when the Tet Offensive happens, it really doesn't do anything except bolster this feeling that maybe the Democrats need to look for a new candidate. Because remember, the ultimate goal of your party is to win. And if your party is not going to win, then that's probably not the candidate you should be going with. At the New Hampshire primary, and New Hampshire is always the first state to launch primaries, Eugene McCarthy pulls in 42% of the Democratic vote, with Johnson getting 48%. And while he wins, it's still seen as a major loss. A sitting president should not, one, not have any competition, and two, they should skunk the competition that is there. And that's not the case. And so the Democrat Party really kind of begins exploring, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to make our candidate winnable? Because at the moment, he is not winnable. Doesn't seem to be electable. And then based on that result, Robert Kennedy says, well, if the American public, and certainly if the Democratic Party, is not supporting Johnson, then maybe that's something that I should consider. Maybe I should consider running again, because I need to do what the American public wants. So Robert Kennedy throws his hat in the ring for the 1968 election. And pretty much that sort of ruins it all for Johnson. He decides that he's going to run in March of 68. So January, you have the Tet Offensive. March of 68, Robert Kennedy says that he's going to run in the election. That's right after Robert Kennedy's like, yeah, I'm going to run. Johnson does something that's pretty much unprecedented. He gets on TV and tells the American public that he is not seeking another term in office. And in fact, if his party nominates him, he is not going to accept the nomination. He's basically going to serve out his term, and he is done. He also says that he wanted the war to win. He wanted to end the war, but he doesn't do that. He just continues what's called escalation. He just continues escalating the war and sending more and more troops over. So essentially, Johnson realizes that there's no way he can win. Now, some little side notes about Johnson. One of the things, I think about him that's very interesting is Johnson will retire. He'll go back to his ranch in Texas and he'll retire there. But he later was very famous for saying that he hated, and I'm quoting, that damn war. He hated the Vietnam War. He didn't know in their tapes, and we'll talk about this later, that at the very beginning, he doubted we can win. He didn't think it was a good idea, but he didn't really know how to get us out of the mess once we had gotten into it. Additionally, he wanted to get funding for the Great Society. He wanted to focus on the war in poverty and ending poverty in America, and that's what he wanted to do. But he couldn't do both. He could not both fund a war and fund his entitlement programs that went along with the war in poverty. So he had to give something up. And so while Johnson has victories with with the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, he institutes the war on poverty, which was an unprecedented attempt by an American president to end poverty within the United States. And with all the social programs he does, his presidency is often seen as a failure because he loses because of Vietnam. And so when you think of Kennedy, it's definitely, I'm sorry, when you think of Johnson, it's definitely someone who really, I think, ended up in the end regretting all that had been done with regards to Vietnam, and really he had wanted to focus on the Great Society, which was his domestic plan, which was fighting poverty within the United States. He dies in 1973. So essentially the stage is set for Robert Kennedy to win. Let me slow down. It's set for him to win. Eugene McCarthy is still in it, but not... you just can't catch a Kennedy. And unfortunately, Kennedy won the California primary in June of 1968. And we just want to back up and mention that in April of 68, that's when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. So you've got Tet Offensive, you have the New Hampshire primary, you have Johnson saying he's not going to run again, that's March. The next month you have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., nothing really in May, and then in June we're going to have the assassination of Robert Kennedy, all going on in 1 year. So when I said 1968 was a big year, it really was one of those where month after month after month, something major is happening that has major political consequences. So Kennedy won the California primary. It was all but set that he was going to be the Democratic nominee for president for 1968. He's in a hotel, he gives his speech congratulating everyone, and then he leaves and he's going out the back door through the kitchen, and he is shot by a 19-year-old named Sirhan Sirhan. He's a Palestinian immigrant who shot Kennedy over Kennedy's stance on Israel. Kennedy is pro-Israel, and that's why he was killed. Sirhan Sirhan is caught, and I will show you the video of that. It's not really on video the way that John F. Kennedy's video is on video, but there's still news footage. So because Johnson won't win, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who we've not really mentioned because, why? He decides that he's going to run. And so the Democrats have to choose between Eugene McCarthy, anti-war, or Hubert Humphrey, the pro-war Democrat for the vice president under Johnson. So everything comes to a head in August of 1968. And in that year, the Democrats are going to have their national convention in Chicago. So if you recall, before elections, usually in the summer, both parties have their very big official nominating convention where they come out and say, these are going to be our candidates for president and vice president, and the whole party rallies behind whoever wins. It's usually pretty much already decided based on the results of the primary before that even happens, but this is kind of seen as the official formal coming out. Here's who we're going to vote for. Well, the Chicago 1968 convention was kind of like nothing else. There was a large amount of people planning to protest what they felt was a violation of what the people wanted. Their prediction was that Hubert Humphrey would come out the nominee despite the fact that people had consistently voted for an anti-Vietnam War candidate. Whether they did that with Eugene McCarthy or Robert Kennedy, they were saying that Democrats were not picking a pro-war candidate, and they felt like the powers that be within the Democrat Party were going to kind of circumvent what the people wanted and manipulate the results so that Hubert Humphrey would come out with the win. And this makes a lot of anti-war activists very, very mad. And so Students for Democratic Society, led by Tom Hayden, um, and other anti-war groups show up with about 10,000 protesters in Chicago. And they are outside the Chicago Hilton, and they're protesting rather peacefully on a regular basis. The Chicago police felt like they weren't going to be able to appropriately manage the crowd, so they do call in the National Guard. You can kind of guess where this is going to start going. Um, and to be fair, Students for Democrat Society did have a they had a group called the Weathermen, which was basically a low-key terrorist group that were hardcore and sometimes would go and just start trouble. But that's not necessarily the case here. I'm not saying they're not present, but when you see the footage, you'll see that it's pretty much people just chanting and carrying on peaceful demonstrations. So the mayor of Chicago calls in the National Guard, and essentially what you get is on live TV a showdown. The tension between the protesters and the guards reaches kind of a fevered pitch, and then it just takes one little thing for the National Guard and the police to think that the crowd's out of control. And what people see on live TV are kids being beaten by the police, kids being arrested for protesting. You see tear gas going into kids. You see the kids vomiting with the tear gas in their eyes, and they just see an all-out riot. And you can hear the kids chanting, "The whole world is watching, the whole world is watching." And it's meant to bring attention to the anti-war movement, but also kind of talk about police brutality and the rights of people being violated. Interestingly enough, in the end, Hubert Humphrey does get the Democratic nomination. It's Richard Nixon, who had been the vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, had run against Kennedy and narrowly lost, and he's going to be the Republican nominee. He is basically anti-war in a way. The Democrats are going to run Hubert Humphrey. And there's an American Independent Party member, George Wallace. He had been the governor of Alabama. He's running on the old states' rights campaign, and he is saying segregation now and segregation forever. He will end up shot, so that's going to prevent him from winning that. And Nixon wins the election of 68, essentially because the Democratic Party is just a hot old mess. And Nixon comes in as the one that has it most together. So the election of 1968, that's November of 68, goes to Nixon. The end of Vietnam. So in the summer of 1969, Nixon so he's elected in November of 68. About 6 months or so into office, he announces that the Americans are going to withdraw from Vietnam. But in order for that to happen, there has to be a meeting between the Viet Cong, the leader of South Vietnam, the Americans in North Vietnam. And we try to get the North and South Vietnam to agree on terms, and that won't happen. And so it all sort of falls apart. What we're trying to form is one Vietnam with a coalition government. So that's representatives from different sides. And nobody within the country of Vietnam seems to be cool with that happening. Nixon had his national security advisor is Henry Kissinger, who is pretty much a genius. He was an international expert. He had 3 degrees from Harvard, and he comes up with something you need to know called the Vietnamization plan. And the plan of this was we were going to gradually withdraw from Vietnam. We were going to enable the South Vietnamese troops to take over, and we were going to call what was called peace with honor. We were going to keep our dignity while we withdrew from the war that, remember, was never actually a war because of the blank check. And that was the way that we thought we would kind of not look like we had lost. And that was the plan. It's been our plan in current military maneuvers as well. So while this is happening, and that's what's being promoted to the American people, so that's what the American people are hearing, Nixon secretly begins ordering bombing of the supply routes around the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which means bombing Laos and Cambodia, because the idea is if we could stop the Viet Cong from getting supplied by North Vietnam, it would be easier to end the war. So again, people are getting told one thing, we're doing something else. By August of 69, more than 25,000 troops are back in the United States, and we are decreasing the number. So that is happening. So Vietnamization is what's being promoted. We are lowering the number of troops in Vietnam. We're bringing our troops home, but we secretly are ordering the bombing of Laos and Cambodia, 2 neutral nations. And then the Americans find out about something in 69, which actually happened in 68. So first off, let's talk about the silent majority, and they'll play a major role. They played a major role in the recent election. Nixon believes in something called the silent majority. He believes that most Americans, despite the poll numbers, really support the Vietnam War and the government's actions. But he believes that that culturally we've swung so far to the left side of the pendulum, that we've become so liberal as a society, that the voices of those people aren't being heard, and they're basically being ignored and overlooked, and the news is skewing the numbers. And so he says he's working for the silent majority, those Americans that really still are conservative, that support what the government's doing, that believe in containment, whose voices are being overshadowed by those liberals who make the news. So in 69, we learn about something called the My Lai Massacre. And this occurred in 1968 when a U.S. platoon under the command of Lieutenant William Calley Jr. were searching for Viet Cong, and they come up on the village of My Lai. They don't find any Viet Cong, but Calley orders to shoot everyone within the village, approximately 200 people, old men, women, and children, and they are shot execution style. In fact, his order was kill anything that breathes. And Americans are horrified to see our government and our country sanction something that we thought only the bad people do, that only the enemies did, that this wasn't an American at all. How could this be happening? The Calley, as well as 25 other soldiers, are charged. Calley himself is convicted and sent to prison for war crimes. Again, they used the "I'm just following orders." It did not work with the SS officers in Nuremberg. It didn't work here either. The reason he says he shot them was because he thought that they were covering up and hiding Viet Cong that were in the village, but they were never found. Cambodia. So this is 1970. Nixon's elected in 68. We've been involved in the Vietnam since about the 1961 when the advisors went in under Kennedy. I feel like you think it's never going to end, but we're trying to get it there. So on April 30th, 1970, Nixon makes the announcements that we've stopped secretly bombing and we have now invaded Cambodia to clear out the Ho Chi Minh Trail. People go crazy. It's also about that time that the ability to use your college education or being in college as a deferment from the drafted Vietnam is nixed. So basically, if you're a male, you're a going. And college students go crazy. They go crazy that once again, they've been lied to. It's the credibility gap. It's the fact that, again, they're the ones mostly directly affected it. They're the ones that are going to have to go fight the war that they're not getting a say-so in. And so you have the first ever general college student strikes. 1.5 million students end up closing down over 1,200 campuses. Again, if we aren't at war with Cambodia, if we're winding this war down, then why are we invading them? Why won't the government just say and do, or do what they say they're going to do? Why are they feeding us lies? Why are the wealthy people the ones making the war, but they want us to go fight it? We don't want to fight it. We don't want to fight the Cambodians. We don't want to fight the Vietnamese. We don't believe in the domino theory. The most notable student protest really out of the entire Vietnam War, it happens at Kent State. You've probably seen this image. It won the 71 Pulitzer Prize. The person on the ground is dead. You can see the blood trail behind him. So here's what happens. There was a student protest on the Kent State campus and what we're going to call the quad. So for our purposes, kind of picture at the gazebo. And the kids before had gotten out of control, and they did burn down the ROTC building. So the campus knew that there was going to be protests planned for the following day. So they burned down the building on May 3rd. This is May 4th. And so they call in the National Guard as well as police. And so this protest, again, is happening in the middle of campus, and there are still things going on campus. When you get to college, you'll see in your quad or your common area, there's always stuff going on, but there's still kids walking by trying to get to classes that don't have anything to do with the protest itself. Now, this is kind of reminiscent of the Boston Massacre when you hear the story. So the protesters say that they are peacefully protesting. The National Guardsmen say that at one point the kids began throwing rocks at the National Guard. The National Guard claim for their own protection, they fire into the air, but the fire actually goes into the crowd, and then that starts just a massive chaos again, where 9 people end up wounded and 4 are killed. 2 of those that are killed weren't even participating in the rally themselves. They were simply walking to class, and that's where this picture comes from. And you look at the anguish on this girl's face, the why. How do we come to this point within the United States that we are killing our own kids, on U.S. soil over a war? How did we get to this point where your right to peacefully assemble and your right to protest ends up with you being shot by your own military? And that's really the question that people are asking. How had we gotten here? What had occurred? Had we gotten so divided within the United States that it became okay to shoot our own kids practicing their First Amendment right? There's a massive panic. Interestingly enough, shortly after that at Jackson State, Mississippi, there's a very similar event, almost the same scenario, where 12 are killed and 2 are 12 are wounded and 2 were killed. Both of those were bystanders, and both times the crowd was unarmed. A lot of people, the silent majority that Nixon referred to, supported the National Guard. They didn't have time for those dirty hippies. They didn't have time for these spoiled kids whose parents were paying for them to go to college. They didn't have any of that. They kind of felt like they got what was coming to them. So there's even disagreement over how people felt about the results of Kent State and then Jackson State. Interestingly enough, though, the pressure does get to Nixon, and he pulls out of Cambodia after only 2 months. All right, almost done. I hope you're bearing with me. Congress is super mad at Nixon for invading Cambodia and bombing them without notice, but remember he was allowed to because of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, the blank check. And so on December 31st, 1970, they repealed that. No more blank check. So Nixon can't take any measures within Vietnam without congressional approval. And keep in mind, Nixon's still practicing his Vietnamization plan, the peace with honor. He wants to end the Vietnam War, or so he says. Then in June of 71, something called the Pentagon Papers happens. This, in a way, will end up being connected to Watergate. So we're going to come back to this. So this isn't going to go away. They're leaked by a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked in the Department of Defense. Essentially, it's a 7,000-page document. Yeah, that's right, 7,000 pages. Written for Robert McNamara in the years of 67 to 68. So kind of at the core of the Vietnam War. And essentially, it shows that the government had zero plans for entering the war. At the same time, we said we weren't getting involved. We were. And we never had a plan how to end the war. We had no clue how to end it. As long as North Vietnam was still involved, we weren't ever going to end the war. We were just going to stay in there indefinitely. And so what Americans saw was written in black and white, large amounts of this were published in the New York Times, was that they had essentially been lied to by the government. Imagine if your son, your father, your friend had gone and died in Vietnam. For what you're seeing was almost nothing. Your government had no plans. They had no idea what to do. They didn't even really believe that it was stopping the spread of communism. And yet the government wouldn't end it. Can you imagine the frustration and the anger that you would feel, and the treatment of the American vets when they came home from Vietnam? We treated them horribly, horribly. And if there's anything Americans have learned, is that we do not take out our frustrations of war on our men and women doing their job, particularly when they were drafted to go to the war. And if there's anything, there are no parades. There was no nothing for our Vietnam soldiers. And we have learned from that, thankfully. March of 1972, essentially, I'm going to make this really quick. We begin bombing again, and then earnest plans to actually end the war begin occurring. Real plans. The election of 1972, it's Nixon versus George McGovern. George McGovern says that he will end the war within 90 days. Interestingly enough, 12 days before the election, Henry Kissinger announces peace is at hand, and that helps Nixon. He wins. Now, we'll talk about Watergate and what went on in the election of 72 later, but the fact that right before the election, the Republicans are able to say, hey, we're on it, we're making it happen, that does cause a change. So the long story short, there's a whole bunch of bombs that we drop before the war ends. The war ends January 27th, 1973, with a peace agreement. The last of American troops leave Saigon in March of 73, and here's what eventually happens. The war continues within the Vietnamese themselves. Their civil war continues. In March of 1975, the North invades the South. The U.S. sends them money. But in April of 1975, South Vietnam does fall to North Vietnam, and they become totally communist. And guess what? The countries around them don't fall to communism necessarily. The world doesn't end. America isn't taken over by communists. And that's kind of where we'll leave it. And you can draw your own conclusions with regards to Americans' involvement in Vietnam. What's the result? The credibility gap. People just don't believe their government. They have so many examples to point out where their government told them one thing and another thing happened, and they're frustrated and they're angry. The War Powers Act. No more blank checks. No more Vietnams. It's designed to prevent another Vietnam from ever happening again. The president must report to Congress within 48 hours of putting troops in harm's way in a foreign country. And there's a 60 to 90-day limit with which the president can put American troops anywhere without congressional approval. And then it brings in new isolationism. America says, look, we're just done. We're done with all of this. And we're going to continue to be committed to stopping the spread of communism, but we're also going to stay away, supposedly. And we'll end.